Hello, I'm Grace Dietzick, and I'm here with Maria Hrycelak, and this is an interview about the history of the Kalo shop and Clara Barkwells. So, well, I just said your name, but what's your background?
Well, I grew up in Chicago. I'm a just retired pediatrician who has a practice in Park Ridge, and I got interested just by a fluke in the Kalo Foundation.
So what's the role that you play in the Kalo Foundation today?
At this point, I started out as membership chair, and now I am co-president of the Kalo Foundation with Judy Barkley. There's two of us.
So kind of getting into the history of the Kalo shop, what about Clara Wells inspired you to research her life?
Well, I think after I had read and been informed about some of Clara's past, it really impressed me that 100 years ago this woman could have a business. I mean, I, as a businesswoman, kind of associated with her, could identify with her. And yet 100 years ago, the barriers that were there for women were so large that it really impressed me that she could have a business in Park Ridge, on Michigan Avenue, in New York City. So I was curious to see what she was really like.
So you said that she was like ahead of her time. So what did she do to set her apart from other women?
Well, number one, that she opened up a business on her own. That's in itself very unusual. She hired immigrants from Norway, Sweden, had them become the silversmith. She hired women to be the designers. She had the second largest business in Park Ridge in the 1905. So that was impressive in itself. That she could man a group of 25 employees, I give her credit. She was involved in suffrage movement. She was a humanitarian when the war was there. So a lot of things that were just ahead in one sense and just Renaissance woman in another. She could do a lot of different things.
So how did Clara Wells treat her employees at the Kalo shop?
Well, this is an interesting thing. Her employees, she had a very good relationship with the employees. I think a lot of them were happy to have a job because they were immigrants. And she would allow them, if they finished their work at the Kalo shop, if they wanted to make silver or do silver work on their off time, she let them sell it. As long as it didn't say Kalo on it, they could put their own name on it. And so she supplied the workspace, some of the tools, everything, and she didn't take a percentage of that. The other thing is, for example, every Christmas it was a tradition at the Kalo shop that she would allow them to take as much silver as they want and make a present or a gift for their family. And it's something that continued for the 50 years she owned the shop. So employees almost never complained. There was maybe one incident when somebody said, oh, you didn't pay me the stocks. She actually gave stocks later on to the employees when she gave up the shop. She just gave them the shop in 1959. So that's unheard of, that somebody wouldn't sell it, would just give it.
So in the time of the arts and crafts movement, a lot of things were being made in factories, but why were the Kalo products better than the factory products?
Well, they were handmade. Everyone was a custom piece. So if you had a wedding shower to go to, you would contact them and say, I want this piece for Jane's wedding shower or Jane's bridal shower, and they would make it. They would hammer it. They would hand, flatten the silver. They would arrange it. They would design it. You can't get that out of a machine. It's just not the same. So it was that, and the quality was good. I mean, they knew how much silver they were putting in. They knew what they were doing. So
Earlier you mentioned how she opened up a shop in New York. What was the shop in New York similar to one in Chicago, and how they made things?
Yes, her sister actually ran the shop for a few years in New York. Unfortunately, they opened it just before World War I started. And once the war started, the shop didn't go, so it came back here. Business was slow. But yeah, and when you look on Kalo silverware, you can see Kalo Park Ridge, very rare. Kalo, Chicago, New York, and that will tell you the time periods that the piece is from, because if you have a New York piece, it's less than 1916, so it can't be a newer piece. But she had, in Park Ridge was more of a workshop. This is where the workers would make the things. The shops on Michigan Avenue in New York sold the product.
And was it true that there was actually a Kalo school at one point?
Yes, and the school was in Park Ridge on Grant Place. It's a big white building, and they would live there. The silversmiths, the ones that couldn't afford houses or some that weren't married, would live in that house. And the Kalo shop was actually a community of artisans, and it was an arts and crafts school more than it actually was the shop, although they produced products too. But she liked to teach people. She allowed, I think just as an aside, and after World War I, she let a lot of military veterans who had injured their hands and needed help with fine motor, sort of a precursor to occupational therapy, to come and take classes to try to use their hands and improve their fine motor skills. So, again, something that she thought about that most people wouldn't.
What sort of role did the Kalo shop play in the arts and crafts movement in general?
Well, it was one of the first arts and crafts. It was an important part of the arts and crafts movement because it was a well-known arts and crafts movement. When people talked about Kalo shop, they knew what Kalo shop was. She had already started it in 1900, and then here in Park Ridge, 1905 to about 1914. And that was the peak arts and crafts movement, just before the 1900s and the early 1900s. So when people talked about Kalo, everybody knew Kalo. Park Ridge itself, with Kalo being here, had a lot of other artists at the same time, as you may be familiar, and we have some of them here. So it was a community that everybody knew. Everybody knew Grant, the house on Grant Place. Everybody knew that other artists who worked there, some, and one example I always use is Grant Wood. Grant Wood was a silversmith at first with Clara, but he wasn't very good. So she kind of encouraged him to go into something else. He goes to Iowa, paints the painting everybody knows, and becomes super famous. But here, again, Park Ridge, because of the location, because of her being here, the expanse of Kalo in Chicago, in Park Ridge, in New York, really encouraged arts and crafts, plus made it accessible to the employees, made it accessible to people who wanted to purchase it.
Clara was a suffragist, and so what did she do in that movement?
The biggest thing that Clara is known in that movement is in 1913 she helped to organize a march in Washington, D.C. for the Illinois delegation. And she was actually in charge of, they called it a pageant instead of a parade. And thousands of women got on buses, came over to Washington to protest and bring awareness to the suffragist movement. And she's thought, I actually spoke with her grandnephew, and her grandnephew says that there's a hat that the ladies wear in the famous picture, and that Clara designed the hat. It's funny, but the nice thing about Illinois is it was the one delegation that didn't didn't encounter any violence or any other, a lot of the other states were booed, were, attacked, were this, but for some reason, Clara kind of looked tough. I think with her in the front, people were like, okay. But she actually, led the movement there.
So I didn't know this before, but what would the difference between a suffragist and a suffragette be?
Suffragette was more, is indicated by their aggressive and violent way towards change, whereas suffragists were more the peaceful protesters. Suffragettes were in England, a lot of them. That's where it first started, and the suffragette movement. But the suffragists, the US guys, were much more peaceful, although a lot of the women after a while were getting angry and would occasionally break windows or do something like that. The difference is suffragists are peaceful protest, suffragettes violent protest.
Okay, thank you. So what do you think the greatest struggles were that Clara Wells faced in opening the Kalo shop?
I think it was hiring employees, because nobody wanted to hire other people, and men in general didn't want to work for a woman at that time, a lot of men. That's why the men she got were immigrants who couldn't get a job anywhere else and were very happy to have a job. So just the sexist attitude of, what do you mean you should be home, you should be taking care of your husband and not out opening a business, was one. You're competing with us. So that was one thing. Again, as a business person, she has no say in anything political. So that's, I think, was one of the things that kind of brought her into, besides the humanitarian aspect of it, we're all equal, we should be equal. I think she probably figured this has to help everything if I have open access to everything. But the biggest thing was just plain 1900 is sexist, no question. You should be home having babies, sitting with your husband.
So would you say that the problems that she faced were resolved?
Eventually, for her even, because as they got the right to vote, she resolved that. Her business grew despite anything, despite all what people would have said about her or people would have written about her. It grew. She had multiple stores. The business hung on for 50 years. That's an amazing thing. So I think some of it was resolved. An interesting thing is, do things change now? No, I think you still have some of the same problems in 2018 as you had 100 years ago, that people look a little bit, oh, it's a woman, oh, can she handle it, or should be doing this. So it's a different thing. I think it's become easier, and I think she helped that come easier. One of the people that made it people aware that a woman could do it just as well. So I think some things, were resolved, no question.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming to talk to me today. Yeah.